And in fact, that's actually kind of the call. They say that so that other libertarians will recognize them in a room. Okay. But
taxes are done.
I'm just imagining at a party, someone
Just
in
the
the
bugle.
corner, then people like, oh, I gotta go.
Yeah,
It's like the bat signal for libertarians.
Hello, listeners. Vaden here, recording a quick solo intro, a few agenda items. So first is Ratfest, organized by the one and only Mr. Logan Chipkin. It's happening in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, Friday, September 27th to Sunday, September 29th, and it's going to be a blast. I'm certainly going to be there. I don't know if Ben is. I'm trying to twist his arm. Maybe we can collectively pressure him to join. But last year, I believe Deutsch spoke, Luli Tannant spoke, and all the other names that y'all are familiar with. So come one, come all. It'll be great. I believe tickets are selling out quickly, so message Logan for more information. So in this episode, we are kicking off a series on libertarianism with the excellent Bruce Nielson. Just want to make a quick comment to clarify one thing. In this episode, at the beginning, I say that we are going to be focusing on economic issues. That's not the case. In fact, we focused mainly on moral issues because that's where the conversation ended up taking us. In the following episode, we'll deal with economic issues. So I didn't want people to get confused there. But with that, let us dive in, and here we go. For freedom. Sweet. Well, I am so excited. We have the excellent Bruce Nielson back on the pod. Bruce, welcome back to Increments.
thanks for having me.
So today we are starting a series on libertarianism. Finally, since I've been, shooting daggers on my blog, but carefully avoiding a lot of the nitty-gritty subjects within the master subject of libertarianism that I don't have a good understanding of. And so the hope, the goal over these series of conversations is to kind of have Bruce guide us through a lot of the main topics that one might encounter if one starts challenging some of the libertarian views. And so there's a lot that we'll get into. I'll make a few meta comments later about how we're going to structure this conversation, but maybe just to start, we can do a little round table about how we all got interested in this subject and why we're all here today.
Okay, so first of all, I am a conservative, right? I mean, I'm, at least among crit rats, I think I am the single only one that there is. And I'm a fiscal, small government conservative. I am what many people would call a libertarian, right? I don't personally identify that. Although if somebody says you're libertarian, I go, that's fine. I'm not offended by it or anything. And I think probably 2/3 of people who would say, oh, I'm libertarian, or I'm libertarian leaning, or, I'm libertarian-like or something like that. I think 2/3 of them are me, right? I mean, it's people who are actually small government fiscal conservatives, right? And so it's very easy to get confused between what's an ideological libertarian, someone who believes in the theories behind what's in America called libertarianism, and someone like me who just wants to see less government intrusion and thinks that's not the most effective way to go about doing things, and would really like to see the free market take a lot over, right? So now, as you can imagine, I have a certain political view, and you tend to talk with more people of your own political view. And the echo chamber is a real enough thing. And one of the things that I would discover is I would be talking with people about conservative views, and there would be somebody in the group who would say, oh, I'm a libertarian. And at first they would sound a lot like everybody else. And they would seem like, okay, that you just, I would call you just a conservative. And then they would start to say things, and they would make these moral arguments, and you would go, okay, that sounds kind of nutty. In fact, I'm even feeling a little embarrassed that someone that's on my side is saying something like this, right? So you challenge them. Okay, that doesn't make sense. Why are you even saying that? And then they become really, they're like arguing with you. This isn't just some off the cuff argument. They've put some real thought into this, right? And this is the core of what they believe in. This is what makes them self-identify as a libertarian. So I started bumping into these people. I remember my first one was a guy named Jeff Greenspan, who I worked with at my first job, and he was a super smart guy, right? I mean, like he was this MBA type and, moving up in the world. And then he would start to talk about politics, and he would start to have all these conspiracy theories. And for reasons we can discuss, conspiracy theories and libertarianism actually has a very high overlap in some sections. I haven't noticed that with the libertarian critical rationalists, but the Mormon libertarians here in Utah, there's like this giant overlap between libertarianism and conspiracy theories. And even the ones that aren't Mormon that you just find on the internet, it's very common.
Is it just like the government is controlling everything?
Yes. Yeah. Well, we can talk about, and of course they don't all agree on what are the conspiracies. So it's not like there's some, but we could talk about maybe why I suspect there's a heavy overlap between the two. And then they would start to give me papers to read, and they would say, you need to read this, Bruce. You're not getting it. You need to read this. And they would tell me, I'm going to read an article, and then I would argue with the article. And I'd say, okay, from my conservative perspective, I agree with maybe even the conclusions they're coming to, right? But I think this is a terrible argument. I think this is an awful argument, in fact. And I would kind of take them through, and they'd say, no, that's not right. And as I started to find that I was talking to more people like this, and I was reading things they were giving me as long as it was short, they would often throw books at me, and I would always bounce off the books. And this is something I probably do need to explain, is that I am in no way claiming to be an expert in libertarianism. What I am an expert in is being a conservative that has argued with libertarians, right? So, and this is actually a valuable thing, though. Like, if I could use the analogy that I think maybe Vaden came up with, but anyhow, I think it's a great analogy. If you want to know about Catholicism, there are two ways you could go about that, right? You could sit down with a Jesuit priest, and he could explain to you Thomism, their philosophy, and he could take you through. And that would be a really valuable way to come to understand Catholicism, right? Or you could sit down with a bunch of Catholics, and you could say, what do you as a Catholic actually believe? Now, it's not likely that those two conversations are going to have much overlap, right? One's going to be the kind of theoretical philosophy that the average Catholic doesn't know about, doesn't care about. And the other is going to be kind of at a practical level, this is what Catholics actually believe. Mm-hmm. And I would actually, if you really want to get to know Catholics, you would almost need to go do both of those, mm-hmm. right? So I'm kind of more in that second category. Just by chance, I've talked to many, 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 many libertarians. I've argued with many, 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 many libertarians. I've read the occasional things that I've been given by them, as long as it's not too long. I've bounced off of requests to read Ayn Rand, who I guess technically doesn't consider herself a libertarian, but she's very libertarian in her thought. I know that there's two schools out there of, Chicago school and Austrian economics, and I know that there's even some tension between those two, and I can hardly tell the difference between them because at my level, they seem almost the same. But so I've got kind of vague notions of things. Let me tell you, I have read two of David Freeman's books, and he is one of the best of the Chicago school. So as far as trying to go to the Jesuit priest, this is a case where I actually did go to the Jesuit priest. And I think his books are excellent. In fact, I highly recommend his books. I think that they're entertaining, that they're not going to bore you. I think they do a great job of I read his Machinery of Freedom, which is his argument for why we don't need governments. And I read Law's Order, which I think is even better, which is let's look at law in terms of economic consequences. And I think it's a super well thought out, super valuable viewpoint, right? And one of the things I also love about David Freeman is that he takes a lot of the dumb arguments I've heard libertarians use, and he doesn't repeat them. Instead, he brings them up and says, this is clearly wrong for this reason. So it's like, I want more libertarians to read David Freeman because I want to see some of the arguments that they sometimes use kind of go away, right? So, so this is where I'm coming from, and I'm certainly not claiming to be an expert in libertarian thought. I'm just sort of more, hey, I'm someone who's talked to a lot of them, and so I've interacted with them a lot. And I think that's what happened is I was talking with Vaden, and he's like, what do you, and he's like filling me out. He's like, maybe Bruce is a libertarian. I know Bruce is kind of conservative. So, so he starts asking me these questions, and I start to talk with him about my experience. He's like, oh, you've talked to way more libertarians than I have. I'm like, yeah, that's true.
Yeah, I think I said somewhere that both you and Scott Alexander, whose piece we'll be going through in this series, have very much the scars of battle kind of written all over their face, as I've been starting to experience a little bit.
Yeah, nice. Bruce, it seems like you're mainly focused on libertarianism as an ideological issue and have been battling, as you say, with a lot of ideological libertarians. I'm hoping in this series we can, draw distinctions about where ideology enters the fray and where there are just sort of typical political and economic arguments
That's
in favor of various libertarian policies.
Yes.
And it sounds like you're even on the side of a lot of those policies. So that'll be great. And you can walk us through reasonings for those and critiques of them, et cetera.
And not only I'm on a lot of the sides that libertarians are, right? I mean, if you were to try to look at me purely in terms of let's remove the ideological and moral arguments and let's just talk about the economics, I often end up completely agreeing with libertarians, or they agree with me, you might say. I mean, conservatives have been around longer than libertarians, so.
And I think those two sides of it are why this subject is so fascinating in some sense, because you have this deep ideological strand, and the ideological proponents seem to actually differ in their claims based on where they are in the world. European libertarians might differ in their moral claims about libertarianism versus Americans versus Canadians, etc. So I'm excited to dive into all of that. Why I'm excited to do this series in particular is because while I'm not a libertarian, and why will become presumably apparent as we continue the series, I do think libertarianism offers one of the most important critiques out there insofar as our just daily lives are concerned. So, in the US and Canada, we have pretty big governments, and governments do a lot of things. And that can go well, that can go poorly, but it's always good to have people in society who are very skeptical of government's involvement in anything and asking whether we can come to solutions without government involvement, what the trade-offs are involving government, whether government's actually making things worse, etc. Now, I'm not always going to argue that government is making things worse. I think that'll be one of the, our key takeaways, especially in this first episode, about examining certain economic issues and why you might require government to resolve some of them. I think it's super important for us to always have some subset of society asking, is government actually necessary here? Because handing power to government, can have pretty negative consequences and is a non-trivial decision to make as a society. When you're putting government in control of things, history is replete with examples of that going poorly for one reason or another. And so I think, you have to be very careful with the sorts of power you're giving government. You have to be very aware about how government's incentives might differ from the populace's incentives and, in short, what can go wrong. And so, I find myself in this sort of weird situation where I'm certainly not, wouldn't call myself a libertarian. I'm not even sure if I would, come close to that. But I do find myself, especially as I get older, which is interesting, increasingly maybe libertarian curious, or on the side of conversations where I'm finding myself playing the role of the semi-libertarian critic, asking okay, is there not a way in which we can let people sort out, problems for themselves, et cetera? Is government involvement necessary here? Is it making things worse, et cetera? And so, so I'm interested to I guess, stress test all my views on these points with maybe Vaden coming from the left and Bruce, you coming from the right. And hopefully I'm nicely sandwiched in the middle somewhere and we can all sort of either converge or diverge at the end of the series.
Let me just add something to what you just said, though. So you wrote a post recently about why dogmatism is good. And I know I did a podcast on that at one point, Ben.
Yes, my apologies for not listening to your podcast before I wrote the post.
Both of which we'll link to in the episode notes.
Well, I actually think this is a good example of what you're talking about.
For sure.
If I were to be honest with myself, conservatives like me are kind of very rare right now, right? If you are a conservative like me, you either gave up on it and became, Trumpist if you're in America, or you became a libertarian. And I honestly, I think that even if we want to try to say some of what libertarians believe is dogma, that may be precisely why they didn't go the Trumpist route, right? And they stuck to their guns and had this moral theory that they wanted to hold to and didn't see Trump going that way. And I think people like me that are kind of ideological conservatives, I would be hard pressed to find very many of me today that haven't kind of gone way towards the libertarian side at this point.
Yeah, I think there's a recent autobiographer, I'm forgetting her name, maybe Jennifer Burns or something. Anyway, it wrote a biography of Milton Friedman recently where she called him the last conservative. And it was sort of for this reason, where she identified, conservatism as this movement that Friedman came to represent, but sort of recognized that after him, conservatism really took on a different tone, especially as it got associated sort of bijectively with the Republican Party, and then became... Right. We don't have to get into all of this, but in some sense, distant from its historical roots. I know what you mean by sort of conservatism as it was represented maybe in the 60s and 70s and 80s seems to have disappeared to some extent from at least in America.
It's me.
But yeah, so you're holding the line. You're holding the line, Bruce.
I am holding the line.
And so maybe just to put my cards on the table a bit, the last thing I'll say is just that while I think libertarianism offers many valuable critiques, policy by policy and issue by issue, my overall criticism is just that it assumes a priori how a state should be run. And it's in this way, it's much like any ideology. So I think, communism and socialism and libertarianism share many of the same qualities in this respect, in assuming how a perfectly organized state should and will function. And so I basically just put, I'm sure we'll talk about some of the libertarians' favorite phrases like taxation is theft and all government is coercive, et cetera, et cetera. I much put these in the same bucket basically as stuff like each according to his ability, to each according to his needs, and X and X is everything's a right on the left. Like healthcare is a right, and not being poor is a right, and all these things, and like defund the police and stuff. So I basically put all these sort of slogans in the same category as ways to just be reflexive and unthinking in your support for various things.
That was so good. I don't think we need to hear from Vaden. I think we can.
Yeah, well,
I'll keep it brief. I'm good at that.
By episode 100, I'm hoping that it'll just be me. I'm edging him out.
So how did I take an interest in this? So I should say that both Ben and I are from Canada, and there doesn't seem to be as extreme a libertarian streak in Canada. When Ben and I got into the online crit rat space, both of us were quite surprised to see how many libertarians were kind of orbiting David Deutsch. That was quite a surprise to both of us. At that time, I wanted to just keep my distance from that particular set of views because I didn't understand them well enough to critique them. It was always in the back of my mind, like, okay, at some point, we're going to need to get to this subject, but I didn't have kind of the confidence or the background knowledge to start doing it. Then a couple months ago, maybe 3-4 months ago, I got into a debate with a libertarian / critical rationalist. And that's when I became obsessed with this issue because of the overlap with critical rationalism. And because I do know critical rationalism decently well, I could start to see some of the cracks in a lot of the things that they were saying. And that's what motivated the 2 blog posts that I wrote. But again, those blog posts are very much coming at it from the CR perspective and not the libertarian perspective. The goal for this series of conversations is to try to do the whole libertarian topic from the top to the bottom. And the way that we're going to loosely structure it is by following Scott Alexander's post, which we'll link to in the show notes, called The Anti-Libertarian FAQ, Frequently Asked Questions. So this is a post which I read about 10 years ago, and I knew that I would need it later in life when I eventually met the people that Scott Alexander was battling with online that caused him to write this piece. And so I read it, and it had a big impact on my worldview because although he doesn't use the phrase incrementalism, it's very incrementalist in the sense that he's just advocating, let's take it issue by issue, people. Let's take it piece by piece. Let's not start with the assumption that the free market is always the best or the government is always the best. Let's just go case by case and see, does the free market work better here or does the government work better here? And that approach has kind of informed not only my political views, but my views on philosophy and my views in science and my views on a huge swath of subjects. And so I guess I just want to say a few points of agreement with the libertarian view, because I'm certainly not as critical of it as I think my blog posts would maybe sound from the tone of them, because what I'm critical of is dogmatic ideology. But there's like the Fifth Column podcast and the Fifth Column guys who are libertarians, and they're great. And so there's a much milder form of libertarianism, which I have a lot of respect and admiration for. I think Christopher Hitchens once said that he doesn't trust anyone that doesn't have a bit of a libertarian streak in them. And that really resonates with me because I understand this tendency to say, like, who the hell are you to tell me what's good for my life? Stay the fuck out of it. And so that libertarian streak I respect. And the other thing I like about, say, the Fifth Column podcast and that kind of libertarianism is it's intrinsically against the two poles. So they'll equally criticize the Democratic Party and the Republican Party, and they'll kind of take flack from both sides. I think that that kind of libertarianism, which I have admiration for and respect for, very much trains you to not trust either side and to kind of think for yourself and don't just sit neatly into the polls and take that minority position and argue against the majority. And all of that I love. I just want to actually read 2 paragraphs from Scott Alexander's post that will echo this sentiment. So for the listeners who haven't read the post, it's structured as a series of questions and answers. So question, answer, question, answer. So one of the questions he poses to himself is, do you hate libertarianism? And he says the following: no. To many people, libertarianism is a reaction against an over-regulated society and an attempt to spread the word that some seemingly intractable problems can be solved by a hands-off approach. Many libertarians have made excellent arguments for why certain libertarian policies are the best options, and I agree with many of them. I think that this kind of libertarianism is a valuable strain of political thought that deserves much more attention, and I have no quarrel whatsoever with it and find myself leaning more and more in that direction myself. By the way, just before you go on, I loved that part of the fact, and that is exactly how I feel. Yes, right. Yes, it's like I love libertarians. I love libertarianism as a whole because I feel like they are so valuable. But anyhow, continue. And he says, but there's a certain more aggressive, very American strain of libertarianism with which I do have a quarrel. This is a strain which, rather than analyzing specific policies and often deciding a more laissez-faire approach is best, it starts with the tenet that government can do no right and private industry can do no wrong, and uses this faith in place of careful analysis. This faction is not adverse to discussing politics, but tends to trot out the same few arguments about why less regulation has to be better. I want to highlight this because it's not just the three of us who've recognized this strain. It's a strain which very much does exist. Tyler Cowen has talked about it, and it does seem to be very online. And so I haven't really encountered it too much in the wild. But if you start taking an online presence, they will flock to you somehow, some way they'll find you. And that's where you encounter this. So there's an interesting thing here that strain of libertarianism seems to exist inside of other ideologies. Yeah. Okay. Yes. So you mentioned that there's a whole bunch of them orbiting David Deutsch. Okay. So you've got these crit rat libertarians, right? Well, so I live in Utah, and I am a Mormon, and I live around a lot of Mormons. There is this subculture of Mormonism that is very specifically this ideological libertarianism, and they actually intermingle Mormon doctrine in theology with libertarianism. And I'm not sure they even see a difference between the two, right? Even though they're using the same arguments as my crit rat friends who are all atheists, right? And I think this is something that I've seen other people have noticed it too, that this ideological libertarianism seems to interweave itself into other ideologies. Very interesting. Okay. Yeah. And there's certain commonalities between them, and then you get this kind of flavor difference between them because the Mormon libertarian is approaching this from the standpoint of, God-given rights and theology and things like that, whereas the crit rat's approaching it from this flows naturally from the true epistemology, right? And on day one, God said, "There will be freedom." There will be no coercion. And there's actually a similarity there, where they're always attaching themselves to some sort of authority that says that they're right. Right? Be it critical rationalism or, Mormon doctrine or the Book of Mormon or the Bible or something like that. Yeah, that's a fascinating insight. Yeah, that's crazy. Yeah. So, that's worth a blog post right there, Bruce. Well, it strikes me there's like a bit of an analogy between like maybe if the left and the right are like oil and water, they just can't mix. Like libertarianism is maybe like a dye or something that can kind of go into both of them.
Yes.
And
that's an interesting analogy.
Yeah, it just kind of can blend into everything, but it needs to be on something, in something, and it can't really exist on its own as well. Last little bit of throat clearing before we get into the actual heart of it. So the piece is split into 4 main sections. So there's economic issues, there are social issues, there's political issues, and there are moral issues. And we're going to try loosely to do an episode on each one. We're not going to feel overly constrained, and we're not going to feel like we need to cover every single section, but we are going to try to highlight some of the main arguments and hopefully generate enough curiosity that our listeners will go and actually read the piece themselves. So those are the 4 subjects. Today, I think the goal is to loosely stick to economic issues. But before we do that, we're going to kind of kick it over to Bruce, have him set the stage, give us an intro. Keep in mind that many of our listeners are Canadian, and Canadians don't typically deal with libertarians at all. So it's a very new thing.
Or even on Twitter or anything. So we should keep in mind that it's not a highly online audience necessarily. Yeah.
So first of all, let's take the word libertarian. All right. So this is actually, I'm using it in the American sense. Over in Britain, they have the word libertarian, and it means something entirely differently. Okay. So you even just using the word libertarian by itself is problematic, because you have to know if you're talking to an American or if you're talking to a non-American. Okay. If I've talked to British people, they'll say, I'm a liberal libertarian, or, I'm like, well, those are contradictory terms. And they'll go, oh, no. Libertarian in Britain, it means something totally different. Right. So maybe what we can do to try to help separate the tag libertarian, what do we mean by that for the purposes of this podcast? Okay. So it's not me, even though many people would call me a libertarian. All right. I'm a conservative. Okay. So what separates me from this group, and what could we call them else? Well, one of them you might hear is anarcho-capitalist. Mm-hmm. That might be a better term. Okay. I mean, we could dissect whether that's an accurate term or not. I don't think it is.
Austrianism, is that another overlap?
So that's one of the anarcho-capitalisms, because the Chicago School is also anarcho-capitalist, right? So there's different thoughts. And then like Logan Chipkin, who I know you're good friends with, he told me that the Austrian School of Economics, theoretically, you could be a communist. It's not necessarily anarcho-capitalist. I have never heard someone like that, and I actually have my doubts if that's actually true, but I don't know the ideology well enough. And if they say it's true, then that's probably got to be at least part of their thinking in a certain way, and it's not necessarily anarcho-capitalism. Okay. But like David Friedman, he is absolutely an anarcho-capitalist, right? And he's what you would probably think of as an American ideological libertarian. Okay. By the way, one of the really good ones, one of the ones that's why I said I recommend his books to people, right? You can tell he's making real efforts to try to get rid of some of the bad arguments and replace it with better arguments. He's not there. There's still places where I think he's off base, but you can see that he is really trying to take this idea, the government does a better job in general, and he's really trying to use that realistically. And he buys into some of these moral arguments, but sometimes he kind of goes, well, this moral argument's kind of crap, and here's why.
Just for the audience, it's worth noting that he's actually Milton Friedman's son, which is interesting.
Yes.
Yeah, which perhaps speaks to certain genetic propensities for certain political leanings, but we'll leave that to the side.
So Milton Friedman, I don't know if Milton Friedman would consider himself a libertarian. That was why you were talking about Jennifer Burns.
No, I don't think he would, but
the old school conservatives, right? Yep. So and this is a really good example of what I was saying. His son, who clearly believes a lot of things his father believes, now identifies as libertarian rather than conservative. And I think that this is, there aren't that many libertarians out there by comparison to members of the Republican Party or something like that, right? Or they may not, if you're a member of the Republican Party, you may self-identify as a conservative, but your conservatism may have nothing to do with my conservatism of even just 15 years ago, right? Or 10 years ago, maybe. Okay. So what is it that really separates me from someone who self-identifies as a libertarian? it's not the economic arguments, because I agree with so many of the economic arguments, right? It's really the moral arguments, particularly about the legitimacy of governments. I don't buy any of their moral arguments, particularly about the legitimacy of governments, and I think absolutely every single one of them is wrong.
Can you give an example to our listeners of what maybe an economic argument compared to a moral argument would be on the same subject?
I mean, it might just be worth saying that you could take any particular issue of whether government should be involved in some industry, but you could look at that issue. You can make separate arguments for why government should or should not be involved in that industry. So an economic argument would simply point to the economic consequences and perhaps say, if government gets involved here, we're going to have certain issues of, I don't know, for example, regulatory capture or misaligned incentives, or the government's accidentally going to create a monopoly on this resource, and then we're going to have pricing issues, et cetera. Whereas a normative or moral argument simply says, regardless of the consequences, it's wrong to have the government involved here because, typically something freedom.
That's a good way to put it.
So I think maybe it's just worth pointing out that regardless about what we're arguing about, you can bring to bear arguments on that have either a moral tone or an economic tone.
I just want to add one thing there, and a telltale giveaway is the use of the word force or coercion. So
Yes.
These are unbelievably morally loaded phrases and words. So an example is like, how dare the government presume to use force to get me to pay taxes?
Right. Okay.
Yeah.
So let's take maybe some of the things that I would completely agree with libertarians on, right? So the basic argument that you're going to maybe hear coming from a libertarian as well as from a conservative like myself is that the government's not very efficient at doing things compared to the free market. Now, as a conservative, I know that there are exception cases, whereas a libertarian maybe doesn't accept the existence of exception cases. Okay, and that's going to be one of the big differences. But as a general rule of thumb, I mean, you just look at almost anything you can think of where government provides the service and there's some private version of it. I mean, like if cost wasn't an issue and had a choice between public schools or any private school you wanted, most likely you're going to be able to find a much better private school, right? And if you're going to look at how efficient the post office is compared to UPS or FedEx or something like that, right? You can look at some of these cases where either the government used to supply and doesn't anymore, or that there's a government supplier and also a private one, and the private one is almost always better, right? And probably the golden, and this is actually a humorous example because I would have told you this was one of the counterexamples. If someone had told me, private sector could provide space flight as well as governments, I would have said that is absurd. That is absolutely a case where government is going to be more efficient at space flight than a private company, because there just is no profit in it for private companies. So that is impossible. The free market can't do it. And then Elon Musk completely proved me wrong, like 100%. Right. And at this point, it's like, okay, I guess I don't always know when the government is more efficient or not, which is, I think, a fair point.
Just to comment on that, so a bit off subject, but I remember Neil deGrasse Tyson making the point in some conversation that the very often what you have is the government going into a place that doesn't yet have competition or a market whatsoever. So it's a government that funded the first expeditions to the New World. It's a government that first funded the trip to the moon. But after they demonstrate it's possible, then competition kind of creeps in afterwards.
Yeah.
The internet's another example. So there's a number of examples where the government goes first and then the free market comes second.
So obviously the economic argument here is that when you have profit motive, which governments don't have, you've got incentive to keep error correcting your processes and be able to be more efficient. And at some point, free market should, and again, there are exception cases, but I'm just saying as a rule of thumb, free market should be able to take over almost anything the government can do, and it's going to do it better, right? And there is this is the conservative viewpoint, right? Why do we keep having the government take stuff over when if we just let the market do it, it's going to come up with a more efficient solution? Now, again, I'm talking in such hand-wavy ways, and I'm probably setting off alarms to Vaden, who's going, Bruce, you're
just pulling out his hair right now. You should see him listening to this.
No alarm, but I am. There's a couple comments I want to make that are even more introductory than that, because I'm imagining some friends of mine in BC that are like, so are libertarians just like a kind of conservative? Is it just a flavor of the right? And so what I want to say there, I get even more introductory is, so libertarianism, the root of the word is about liberty, right? So it's all about individual autonomy, individual freedom, individual choice. So you can be a social libertarian, believing that the government shouldn't have any business to dictate your sex life. So I would very much be a social libertarian in the sense that I don't think the government should be involved in the bedroom. I don't think the government should mandate the kind of drugs you can take, with the exception of like highly addictive drugs like opioids and say benzodiazepines and that kind of thing. And so some people will just say, yeah, I'm a social libertarian, and be referring to a set of policies about, say, legalizing prostitution, legalizing drugs, those kinds of issues. Fiscal libertarians would be much more on the, I don't think should be high taxes. I think that individuals and companies should have their money in their own pockets so they can invest it in the ways that they deem most suitable. But so to the question of if libertarianism is on the left-right axis, it's kind of not. It's very much orthogonal. And so you can be like a left-wing libertarian and be more on the social side of things, or you can be more of a right-wing libertarian and be more focused on the fiscal side of things.
So libertarians claim that there's two axes. And by the way, I don't think this is a good argument, but I'm just to represent the way I have heard it from libertarians. Okay. Yeah. They think that there's a moral axis. Should the government be involved in your moral life? Mm-hmm. And then a kind of, economic axis, should the government be involved economically? And then they would say that conservatives are really strong on the moral axis, but low on the fiscal axis. Mm-hmm. And someone from the left would be really low on the moral axis and really high on the fiscal axis. And then libertarians are really low on both. And this is why you might see, like in where I live, a libertarian bumper sticker that says, I believe in pro-choice in everything, or something like that, right? As they see it, they see it as example. We're in favor of pro-choice fiscally and morally, where the left is only in favor of pro-choice morally, and that's kind of how they see themselves, is that they've got these two axes and everybody is trying to put themselves on a single axis, and there's actually these two axes.
Most people, like most listeners, will probably identify various areas of their life where they are libertarians of some flavor. So, on the left, often there's libertarianism around bodily autonomy, et cetera. On the right, about, for instance, property and gun rights and taxes and stuff like this. I think in this, and we'll see if you guys agree with this, but I think maybe for just the ease of presentation of the episodes here, maybe we should just identify libertarians as those who don't want government involvement in any aspect of life, whether so, like, I'm not sure if it's going to be useful here to distinguish between social and fiscal libertarianism, and rather we'll just identify libertarians as those who want either no or restricted government involvement across all areas of their life.
So, and I think that is what separates me as a conservative from the ideological libertarians I've talked to, right? They consistently believe that either there should be no government at all, there should be no state. Okay, that's why they call themselves anarchists, which is such a misleading term because they don't really believe in just pure anarchy, right? I think it's a provocative, intentionally provocative term, in all honesty. Right? Where they actually believe the state is always bad. You might find a strain where it's like, well, we think we still need the state, but only for defense against other nations, like some sort of super restricted role for the state. And even those, I used to find those all the time when I was younger. Those seem to be disappearing. The ones that most of them now just sort of say the state's wrong. The state is wrong. So the one thing that really identifies what we're calling ideological libertarianism or anarcho-capitalism is that government is immoral. Okay. You might get, like I said, various degrees of that. So the one that you hear in America the most is taxes or theft. If somebody says taxes or theft, you know they're an ideological libertarian, right? And in fact, that's actually kind of the call. They say that so that other libertarians will recognize them in a room. Okay. But
taxes are theft.
Yeah, just imagine at a party, someone in the corner, then people like, oh, I gotta go. Like the bat signal for libertarians. Like I'm being called.
Someone is being coerced. Libertarian.
There must be a socialist here. We must attack.
Sorry, Bruce.
You guys have probably heard me use the term meaning meme before, which is a term that
it's an original term too, right?
Yes. The concept is something most people are aware of. It's just they've never had a good term for it. You know how like people will say, oh, I've got problems with religion. And then you'll say, like give me an example. And they'll say, well, like communism. It's like, well, no. They're like atheists. So no. To me, communism is a religion. And at some point I realized we're trying to use the word religion because it's emblematic of something else, right? What's that something else? Well, that's the meaning meme. Okay. So religion is a type of meaning meme. A meme is, just like David Deutsch put in Beginning of Infinity, it's an idea, and then it causes you to enact things, which then cause the idea to spread. Typically, there's some sort of moral element to it. I often call them moral meaning memes, or just meaning memes for short. You have this idea that there's some truth, some moral truth that must go out to the world. In the case of religion, that's really obvious, right? You've got some sort of theology or revelation from God that must go out to the world, and that drives members of that religion to want to proselyte or to try to bring members of their friends or family or neighborhood into alignment with their beliefs, things like that, right? Now, if you're not actually a religion and you're a communist, the same thing. Marx revealed this truth, moral truth about the world, about classes, and it's really important that this truth go out to the world, and you've got to convert people to understand this, okay? Now, I'm intentionally trying to make it a neutral term because I think there are just meaning memes all over the place, and they're often really, really, really good, right? Now, obviously, meaning memes, I always say this, meaning memes are dangerous, but that's okay, right? They do so much good, and we should just recognize that there's always a danger to a meaning meme. Okay, every single point of view has got some errors in it, and once it kind of becomes part of your identity and part of how you see yourselves, you're going to be a little blind to maybe some problems with that view, and it's going to be hard for you to challenge it. So meaning memes are always dangerous. But that's why we have open societies. I mean, if you were to take a communist in Russia, they're very dangerous. You take the same communist and you put them in the middle of America, and they may actually do some good, right? They may force you to, through arguing with them, to think more about workers, okay? And I call that the Popperian filter. Obviously, that's a very critical rationalist way of looking at it. But open society takes these meaning memes and it creates a filter so that the good parts of the meaning memes get through and the bad parts just don't have the ability to spread that far, okay? But they're all dangerous. And we just have to always kind of recognize our ideologies are always somewhat dangerous. And it's important that we try to set up a society so that our excesses just can't get through the Popperian filter. Okay. So there are certain things that are common amongst meaning memes that are analogous to religion in various ways, right? Well, one of them is that to be able to exist as a group of people. So let's say that this isn't just an idea you want to spread, but it's part of a community. It's very common for meaning memes to form communities. Okay, especially since the advent of the internet. To exist as an individual group identity, you have to have some way to be able to tell if you're in or out of the group. Okay, and it has to be pretty visible. Okay, so for example, as a Mormon, I don't drink alcohol or smoke. And so you're going to see me at a party and they're going to be pouring the alcohol. I'm going to say, sorry, for religious reasons, I don't drink alcohol. And immediately people go, oh, he's Mormon, right? That is kind of the point, right? Is it creates part of this group identity and it allows us to bond as a group and to be identified as a group. Okay. And that's not a bad thing either. I'm not saying it is. Okay. I mean, again, they're always dangerous. It could be bad, but there's no reason why it has to be bad. For a libertarian, taxes or theft plays exactly that role, right? It immediately says, I'm in the boundary, and if you disagree with me, you're outside the boundary, and we know immediately that you're part of that group identity.
And it's an invite for a debate, right?
And it is an invite for a debate. Okay. Now, let's say, though, that you're a libertarian, but in Britain, and I'm using the term libertarian in the American sense, not the British sense. Okay, so you're an anarcho-capitalist and you're from Britain. You're not going to probably agree with the statement taxes or theft.
Oh, interesting.
Okay,
Okay.
I've talked to I don't think they would mind me mentioning their names, but two very good anarcho-capitalists, Sam Kuipers and Sarah Fitzclarridge. And both of them, they're from Britain, have said, no, taxes are not theft. That's a dumb way to put it. Okay. But even if you are from this British strain, you do still think taxes are immoral. Okay. You just don't think theft's the right word. Okay. So the underlying commonality is that there's this government, it has coercion, it's coercing you, taking the taxes from you. That's your money. They don't have a right to take it. And so that's immoral. And so we need to do something about that. Okay. We need to get rid of having taxes because according to this way of thinking, the only correct way to do things is through consent, and that has to be through a contract from the free market. And governments that are states, by definition, you're not in a contract, or so they say. I'm going to actually challenge that. So therefore, it is coercive, it is force, and it is immoral. Okay. And kind of the example that is really kind of emblematic of it is that video I had you guys watch, George Ought to Help.
Assume the audience hasn't heard it.
Okay, so maybe let's talk about what that video shows. So there's supposedly Bitbutter on Twitter is the one who made that video.
Oh, okay.
He claims he did. So George Ought to Help is this video where the story goes that that you're walking along and you're with your friend George, and another friend comes up and they say, I'm in a difficult financial circumstance. I don't know how I'm going to feed my kids. Could you possibly help me out? So you decide to go ahead and give money to this friend. And then you look over at George, and George doesn't want to give money to a friend.
Fucking George. It's typical of him.
Yeah.
He does this all the time, and I've been trying to get him to share, but yeah.
And so even if you want to argue George ought to help, is it okay to force George to take his money and to give it to this friend who's in need? Okay. And then it kind of goes from there. It asks the question, okay, would it be okay? And so most people would say, no, it's not okay to take this money from George and give it to the friend just because they're in need, even if he ought to help. Okay. But so would it be okay then if there was like 20 friends and they all had a vote, and then anyone who, the majority says we should all give money to George, at this point, is it okay, to not George, to the other friend, is it okay now to take this money from George and give it to the friend? And I mean, obviously, no, you shouldn't. Okay. That would not make any sense. Okay. So then you kind of just go up from there. And the idea is that there is no possible justification, so goes the argument, under which you could take money from people through taxes and give it to other people through wealth redistribution. And that is in and of itself as immoral as if you were to force George to pay.
Interesting.
Okay.
Yeah.
So that's the argument. That's the Steelman version. I'm willing to Steelman it more, by the way.
Yep.
But I would like to get you guys criticizing it while I attempt to Steelman it.
So when I saw that video, it made me think about just how powerful framing is, because you could set up an entirely different frame on what's...
You're going exactly where I would go with this.
Yeah.
Okay.
Interesting. We think very similarly. It's like, so I was thinking, okay, if I was to do a different story, it would be something like, okay, you and your family have been running from the wolves, shivering in the rain for 16 years, and you've lost a number of your kids, and you see in the distance this walled garden with bright lights emanating out of it. And you can see that everyone inside looks happy and they're coordinating, and there's a thriving society. And you knock on the doors, and the elders say, yes, come on in. But we have membership fees. And our membership fees are progressive in the sense that you will work and we'll provide you safety and comfort. But every dollar you make, a certain percentage of it will go to your membership fees. And at any point, you're welcome to leave and go back into the wilderness. But if you stay, or if you have children who are born here, they too will have to pay membership fees. If you do it that way, it's no longer coercion. And if you reframe taxes as like a YMCA annual membership fee, then it's something that you are paying in return for civilization. And so which of these stories is right and which of these are wrong is entirely a moral framing question. And so when I saw that video, I just thought that, yeah, if you as a libertarian set up the conversation as stealing from George compared to George voluntarily paying membership fees, then you can go in very different directions and frame taxes in different ways. But I personally do not feel like someone is stealing from me when I pay my annual taxes. I feel like I'm getting the membership benefits of living in a civilized, safe society. So that was my reaction.
By the way, that is very close to what I try to argue to libertarians, but I want to give my own framing, which is a little bit different, but it's super close.
Nice.
Super close.
Nice. Yeah.
Nice. So yeah, I had two distinct but perhaps related reactions. The first is that I think this ignores the fact that in the taxation case, we have to recognize that everyone's benefiting from certain like public infrastructure that the taxations are funding. So the very fact that we're walking down the sidewalk and then you see George's friend, oftentimes these sidewalks, the amenities that we were just using, et cetera, are funded by taxes. So you're not an island in this sense and the thought experiment avoids those details precisely because the scale is so small, right? Like George's friend that you're trying to help wasn't responsible for your well-being in any sense. These are just purely people who you are not necessarily involved with. But as you scale things up and you actually examine what taxation is used for, there are these interdependencies between people that I think the thought experiment leaves out. Now, a libertarian response to that might be, yeah, but I am not choosing those interdependencies, and I don't want a world in which sidewalks are provided by the government as a public good, etc. And, I want a world in which the precise things I'm spending my money on, I dictate all of those, and it's free for me to dictate all of those. And then I think there are several responses in turn to this. One is to say, well, you're not being coerced to stay in the state you are in, which spends its taxes in a certain way, or the country, etc. So you are free to vote with your feet. And I've always found this odd because libertarians, a big part of their worldview is precisely voting with their feet, right? They'll often talk about smaller scale communities, et cetera, where you're voting with your feet. And it's unclear to me why that argument simply doesn't apply at the state or country level. So, Liberia has a very different taxation system than the US. So do the Bahamas.
Have you ever raised this with a libertarian? Do you know what they actually say? Because I do.
Because that'll be great. So that'll be awesome. Okay. So that's one point. A related point is that I think even if you take the libertarian project very seriously and examine what sort of world would result as a function of the sort of reforms they're putting forward, you don't actually escape the situation of taxation. And so this relates to Vaden's point, where they often envisage sort of smaller scale communities. They might call these proprietary communities like Friedman does. They might call them communes, etc. But they envision sort of these small scale communities where you voluntarily choose to be a part of these communities, and these communities collect some sort of, money from you. In other words, they collect taxes to enable to provide public goods to avoid the externality problems that we'll talk about in the economic section, et cetera. So in some sense, they're just like smaller scale governments. But if you just think carefully about this, so yeah, perhaps a world like that could work, but it's very unlikely that you'll find a commune or a community that spends its money precisely in the way that you would like, right? In other words, they are collecting money from you and spending it suboptimally according to your point of view. How is that not theft, right? Like they're taking money from you. They're spending it in a way that you wouldn't like. But that was the original libertarian critique of this whole thing, is that the government's taking money and spending it in ways I don't like. I don't see how their solution avoids that problem. So now we're in a situation where even the kinds of solutions they're proposing are leading us to a situation where there's still something equivalent to taxation, and it's still taxation of a kind you don't like. And so now you're just in this weird thing where, okay, any kind of world, any sort of solution you can give me, we still have the problem of quote unquote taxation is theft. Yeah. And so now you're just using a word. So we have this unavoidable situation right? And sure, there are better and worse versions of it, no doubt, right? But we're in this world where, like, there's going to be taxation. So is there just unavoidable theft in any world? And so you just totally leave out all the actual necessary details to talk intelligently about, like, better and worse forms of taxation and stuff. And so it's just an unconvinced, like, if you're proposing that something's theft, but it's inevitable in any sort of world, realistic world that you can talk about, then something's missing, right? Like, you can't.
Brilliant.
Okay, so both of your answers are very good. All right. But I am going to play the steelman devil's advocate, and I am going to now argue this with you. Okay. And so first of all, I'm going to have to move between speaking as Bruce and speaking as the devil's advocate. So, and I need to probably do both a little bit at the same time. So first of all, let me just, as Bruce, say that libertarians aren't actually against governments. It just so happens that libertarians define the word governments in a special way, specifically to refer to public governments. What libertarians, what anarcho-capitalists really believe in is what I would call privatized governments. Okay. But they still believe in government. They still believe that there is going to, and this is actually, this isn't necessarily a negative. Like, I'm putting it in terms they wouldn't necessarily agree with because they prefer certain vocabulary terms over others. But I've come across so many people where I've had to explain to them, no, libertarians aren't the big idiots you think they are. They do believe in governments. Right. And they'll, no, they believe that you're just supposed to, everybody's on their own. Like, no. In a libertarian utopia, and I'm using that term in the Popperian way, and I think I'm using it accurately. In the libertarian utopia, you still have police forces, you still have courts, you still have lawmaking bodies. Okay. And they still provide the exact same services and play the exact same role that they do today in a government. The difference would be that you have a choice of several of them, and you can basically vote with your money. Okay, so instead of, like Ben says, you can leave, right, the country. The moment you bring that up with a libertarian, they're going to say, what, I have to, like, sell everything I own, change my entire life, and go to some other country? You're putting too much of a burden on me. I want to be able to do that, and I want to be able to do it without having to move. I want to be able to say, you know what, I don't agree with this police force lawmaking entity that I'm contracted with, so I want to withdraw my money from that one, and I want to put it to this other one instead. Okay, now this leads to the question, which I'm sure is running through your mind, of, well, aren't you going to, how is that going to work, right? And what if you got, like, the conservative, Trumpist legal association with, Republicans paying to that one, and you've got the wokest, Democrat one with, people from the left paying to that one? Aren't you just going to end up with a war? So then the libertarian will say, no. I mean, like, maybe that could happen. We're not saying it's an imperfect world, but, like, to be able to stay in business, the free market's going to cause them to tend towards the same morality, because there's this objective morality. If they're crit rat libertarians, they're going to talk about objective morality. And so what's going to actually happen is you're going to have these different lawmaking, law enforcing organizations. By the way, they may not all be one. It may be like the police service is done by one company and the courts is a different company, or it could be that it's all one company. Like, they're kind of a little vague about it because they don't know what it's going to be either. So this is a place where they're allowed to be vague. Okay. And so maybe at first you got two sets of laws, but to be able to have people continue to pay you money for this service, they've got to be able to trust you, which means that they've got to agree with the morality of what you're doing. If they're just sort of saying, well, we're just going to, only protect our people and we're going to rob everybody else, then, like, eventually all the money will go to someone who says, no, we believe in playing fair. And so you're going to end up with contracts between these companies, just like you do in capitalism today. And they're going to end up with rules that end up being the ones that have to cross across several of these companies. And so you are voting with your money, but it's going to eventually, through free market forces, it's going to materialize as a set of similar rules. And then you're at the margins vote. I don't even know if the margins is right. It may be big differences, but it won't be over things like, is murder okay? Or, or things like that.
I can't tell if the libertarian view is just relabeling things, but functionally nothing would change. So, like, would you be paying annual taxes in quotation marks? What are the differences? Like, what the heck is a private government?
Okay, so let's say that I move into my house here, okay, and I'm contracted with some corporation who is my lawmaking, law enforcement body that I'm paying my dues to. Okay, it's not taxes anymore because I have a contract with them. Okay,
it's membership fees. The whole problem could be solved by just relabeling taxes into membership fees. Jesus.
So the IRS is collecting dues and everyone's happy.
Exactly. Yeah.
Okay. So I have this group. Now, why am I contracted with this group when I don't have to be? Well, because then I don't have the protection of the law, right? So if I haven't actually contracted with this company that I want to do, then I'm kind of just on my own. If somebody robs me, they're not going to really be there to the court system doesn't exist for me. There's no way for me to go try to get recompense. So I have this incentive due to the market to want to enter into a contract with this company. Okay. Now, it's not the only company. It's not a monopoly. That's the big difference, right?
Yeah. Can I pause you right there? So
yeah,
that makes sense to me if we're talking about the federal government. But as soon as we're talking about federalism and the fact that you can go state by state and different states have different like state taxes and state rules and stuff, then isn't that functionally equivalent to just choosing the corporation that you want to live in? Compared to choosing the state you want to live in?
You're going to exactly where I'm going to go with this.
Okay, cool. Okay, I'm just jumping ahead.
I'm good. But no, let me keep arguing with you though. Okay, but states are these really big things, and we're talking about a corporation that is maybe either a really small geographic unit, okay, like I don't know, a neighborhood, say, or maybe it's a really big corporation, but like when I move, I can take that corporation has offices in all sorts of what we would today call states. And I can decide, let's look at the states. They're not necessarily geographic, right? So California, maybe I decide I want to join the California Corporation while living in what today we call Utah, right? Okay. So I decide, what, I'm done with the Utah lawmaking body. They're so conservative, and they're so against everything I believe in. And I totally am in favor of what's going on in that California, corporation. So I'm going to withdraw my money from the Utah one while still living in my same house in Utah. Okay. And I'm going to start paying for California to take care of me instead. Mm-hmm. And by doing that, I've now voted with my feet, and Utah starts to realize, oh no, we're losing customers. We better change our laws to be more like California's, right? And so then I say, oh, you know what? It's a lot better if I go with Utah's. Their office is closer to me anyhow. Yeah. So I start paying to them again because now it's worth it to me. Okay.
But certain things are going to require geographical proximity, right? Like the provision of police, even courts to some extent, but the provision of any like public good, clean air, water, or anything that has to do with like noise pollution, light pollution. It's unclear to me how you're paying California to provide you with those sort of services. Like, I grant that for some things this might work, but for other things, you're literally going to have to move.
And also, this is already happening. Like, isn't there a flood of people from San Francisco to like Austin, Texas, for instance, because the taxes are too high? And
do we think it's worth defining public goods and giving a slight background if we're going to linger on this point? Yeah. So correct me if you think I have any misconceptions or anything. But a public good typically is defined as a good with two properties. One is that it's non-excludable, I believe people call it, just meaning that it's hard or highly costly to exclude people from using it who haven't paid for it. Yeah, so once the infrastructure is there, people can take advantage of it without actually paying for it. So if you think of, just one example to keep in mind, like clean air or something, right? Like once the air is clean, it's hard to charge people for continuing to use the free air, because what other alternative are you going to have, right? If they're walking around outside, they're gonna reap the benefits of clean air without actually paying for it. Also, they have to be non-rivalrous. So if I use it, it doesn't prohibit you from also using it. So if I'm walking around breathing the clean air, that doesn't mean that you're going to have less clean air to use, right? So some examples to just make this concrete are typically national defense is an oft-cited public good. Public parks, lighthouses is an old classic, although that's debatable, I think. Clean air, public health. Right. If everyone else is healthy, that actually makes you more likely to be healthy, but you're not necessarily paying for that. And you can reap the benefits without paying anything. And then also things like general knowledge and basic research. It's very few. It's perhaps hard to incentivize private companies to fund very basic research with no immediate payoffs. So that's one thing the government does, and then we all benefit from in the long term. So governments, right? The government solution to this problem is obvious. So governments typically fund public goods via taxation. So they say, okay, everyone's benefiting from clean air, so we're going to put some clean air regulations in place to ensure that our country has clean enough air, and then we're going to tax everyone. How do libertarians propose to actually deal with public goods? Typically, it's what Bruce and I have mentioned, where they imagine some voluntary donation system whereby you sign up to be a member of some small community that is in charge of providing the good. So, for instance, you might move into a small part of a city run by an organization, and that organization will take care of making the parks, making some nice public parks and keeping them clean. Might also create the roads and the sidewalks, etc. And so you're signing up and you're saying, because you've created these, I'm going to pay you some dues. Now we start to run into the problems that now you've basically just created government at a smaller scale in some sense. And then we have the litany of issues that we've already discussed. There are also some interesting funding mechanisms for trying to fund public goods, which perhaps isn't worth getting into right now, but I think is worth talking about at some point. So there are like dominant assurance contracts that Alex Tabarrok proposed in like the late 90s, which is an interesting idea. It doesn't work for all types of public goods, but works for some of them.
So let me throw a few more on, though.
Sure.
Let's intentionally include some that are also more questionable, because a libertarian is going to be approaching these at the weakest point, right? So most people would consider police forces to be a public good. You need somebody who's going to go enforce the laws. Fire engines, fire departments, okay? The post office is the one that the libertarians pick on the most, but a way to make sure that everybody can receive letters, whereas if you privatize it, who knows if everybody can receive letters. Now, that last one is got to be one of the weakest links, right? Because we've got these two excellent FedEx and UPS services that really outperform the government-controlled post office in every conceivable sense. And the only reason why they're not delivering your mail today is because it's against the law for them to do so. Okay. Yeah. Now, a libertarian, and like David Friedman really harps on this in his book, he says that there was actually a point in history, according to his book, I've not researched this, so I don't know if this is correct or not, but according to David Friedman, there was this group back in time, maybe like 100 years ago, that was doing a privatized post office, and they could do it so much cheaper than the government that they offered to do all the post office for the government, and they would keep the margin of difference, right? And somebody in the government, according to his version of the story, just was really appalled by that his power was being taken from him. So he put them out of business, because technically you're not supposed to be allowed to do this, although it's existed from time to time. Right. Okay. And I have no reason to challenge this story. If you guys do, fine. I think, at least for our sake of argument, let's assume it's all true, that we could have privatized the post office, but the government competing with it had its own interests, their own desires for power. And this is, so goes the libertarian argument, one of the reasons why the public goods is often the opposite of what you would expect. That who knows, maybe we could privatize police forces and fire engines and everything else you just mentioned. I don't know how to do it. We haven't given the market a chance to figure it out, because we've got the government blocking us from being able to compete in that area. Okay, so I have an argument against that, but I'm not going to make it. That's my Steelman version. What do you guys say to that?
Can I just ask one clarifying question? I've always been a bit confused about why people say the Post is a public good, because it doesn't seem to be non-excludable. Like if you, it seems quite clear that you have this service where if you just set it up such that only people that pay can send or receive packages, it's very easy to exclude people from using it. Like I think the most forceful public goods is those where it's extremely difficult, even if you set up a payment mechanism, to exclude certain people from using it, like clean water, like clean air, like a public park.
You guys are so dang smart. Like I can't get anything past you guys. Okay, so presumably, I mean, I don't know the entire philosophy behind why they put the post office into the government, but you can immediately, there's certain things that the government has a need to make sure is happening. And so I suspect that it's got the same sort of thing going on with the post office. If I were to give an example of this that comes from my MBA program, right now, there's no American company that can compete with making shoes with China, right? There's no way to do that. So in theory, we could say we're going to just let all the shoemaking companies in America go out of business and we'll let China do it. And hey, we believe in the free market, so why not? It'll be cheaper. Okay. But you've got this problem that if we need to ever wage war with China, that suddenly they can just cut off our shoe supply. We've got no shoemakers in America. And now you're literally incapable of waging war with China because they control all the shoe supply. Okay. So America knows this. So what they do is they have a special contract with the one remaining American shoemaking company, and they buy all their shoes from that company in the military so that they can keep that company in business because they have a need to be able to wage war against China, maybe, right? Okay, so this actually comes up a lot of times. It's the very fact that there are other governments out there means that our government, however well-intentioned they might be, they've got to worry about the fact that they may have to wage war with somebody. And so I suspect that it's got the same sort of thing going on with the post office, that they need to be able to make sure communications don't shut down right across the nation. So they may have an incentive that isn't just I'm just trying to hold on to power, although that does come in. I mean, there's a real danger there, right? But they have an incentive to why they need to not allow that post office to go out of business. Okay, so how would a critical rationalist libertarian argue against public goods? So we had a discussion there that public goods is actually a pretty good argument. And we've kind of hinted at one of the main arguments they would make, which is, well, you don't really know that there is such a thing as public goods, right? You may call them public goods today, but it may be the government that's keeping us from getting rid of these public goods. Okay, maybe we could privatize air. Here's the argument that I have heard made multiple times. Okay, it's the
You don't just say it's our best explanation and that just shuts them up. I'm just kidding. Sorry, I couldn't resist. Okay, it's the laws of physics argument. It doesn't violate the laws of physics. So here's the argument. Deutsch has proven that all problems not denied by the laws of physics are soluble. It does not violate the laws of physics that we could move all our current government services to the free market.
Oh my God.
We know that governments are wasteful compared to free markets. So once we do this, they will be more efficient. Ergo, there is no known criticism of the argument that anarcho-capitalism is possible because there are no known laws of physics that says it's not. Thus, anarcho-capitalism is more preferable over governments that are states by this argument because it does not exercise the moral, coercive, absolute monopoly power that an anarcho-capitalist privatization.
Have people actually made that argument to you?
That is almost a quote.
That's a wild
That
argument.
is the most insane thing I've ever heard in my life. Oh my God. Okay, yeah.
Let me focus the conversation then. What is wrong with the law of physics argument?
I think it ignores the fact that you would, even on Deutsch's own terms, taking that seriously, you'd have to create the knowledge of how to do that. So let me give you an analogous situation. There's no law of physics that also says we can't live forever. But you wouldn't just abolish all the hospitals and say, well, we'll figure it out and we'll start living forever, right? You need to actually create all the knowledge of how to live forever. And doing so, even whether we can do so, is unclear. It doesn't violate known laws of physics at the moment. And I would just say the same thing with public goods. Like you can't just we have mechanisms to supply them right now. Those mechanisms are arguably imperfect, but it's done by a government. There's no guarantee that if you just abolish government overnight, we're going to figure out how to fund public goods tomorrow.
Yeah, I mean, no one's arguing that it's physically impossible to organize a society this way. We're just arguing, or at least I'm arguing, that we have to start with what currently exists and then do something that's better than that. And this wipe the canvas clean and let's start from scratch and rebuild. There's no guarantees that it's going to be better whatsoever. And the laws of physics argument just seems like a complete and utter distraction from the question of, is this an improvement on what we currently have, which is the only thing that really matters from my perspective.
Also, it's utopian in the sense that it assumes we will inevitably solve the problem of public goods in a better way, right? So just to turn it around on them and attack them with more Deutschian arguments, right? Like it's just there's an assumption of inevitability that we will, come to the optimal solution of these problems.
So you guys have made a distinction that I think is really important. Okay, so there's a distinction to be made between the argument, someday we may privatize all public goods. Okay, but we have no idea how to do it today. And the argument, we know we can privatize all public goods and that doing so would be a net positive. Therefore, we should have a direction or goal that we're moving in that direction at any given moment. That would always be a positive thing to do. I actually buy the first argument. Like if you were to ask me, I've said this many times, if David Freeman turns out to be right, and I don't know that he might be right? That someday we're going to do away with public governments and we're going to entirely privatize them. Okay, that may be in our future somewhere down the road when the right knowledge has been created. I've got zero problem with that. In fact, I don't even think that that's even necessarily implausible, right? I mean, I just don't know. It requires knowledge that I just don't have today to even make the judgment. Okay, the issue that I really have, and this is really what I want to call out, is I've never argued with the libertarians. I know that we will never have a privatized government, because I don't know that. And that might even be good. What I'm arguing is that you don't know that is always going to turn out to be the right way to solve it, or that we'll even eventually get there. Exactly. Okay, because you don't have that knowledge either. Okay, you're making an argument that you can't possibly know. Okay, so a common argument, anything that is tax-funded, that is a tax-funded public institution can do, a voluntarily funded private institution can in principle do better. This is the underlying thought. And then the laws of physics argument, the problem with the laws of physics argument, in Vaden, you participated on the roundtable about the principle of optimism. This is actually the same problem. Okay. I can say it's not against the laws of physics that we could get rid of public goods and privatize them. And you're right. I don't know of any law of physics that says that we can't do that. I also don't know of any laws of physics that says we can't make communism work. Yeah. Right? That doesn't mean that communism is a good idea. Now, when I brought that up to a libertarian, he said, "Oh no, it's impossible to solve the coordination problem for communism." I'm like, "Is there a law of physics that says I can't?" I mean, I can argue anything with this argument.
Vaden's economic theory says that everyone should just punch themselves in the face repeatedly. And then you say, well, that sounds like a terrible idea. I'm like, well, it's not against the laws of physics. And
but this is interesting though, because I didn't understand the connection before, but now you're clarifying for me why people will claim that economics is a branch of physics. I don't know how common this is in the wider libertarian community, but this is common among critical rationalist friendly libertarians / anarcho-capitalists, where they'll say actually economics is physics. And I think it's because of this claim. They want to backstop economic arguments via physical laws and say, oh, actually something like communism is against the law of physics. It's never going to work, etc.
And also it's a very ironic appeal to the authority of physics, because physics is seen as like the gold standard in science, right? Like what could be more rigorous than physics? Yeah. And so to attach your theory to physics is to basically say our theory is as robust and as deep and well-founded as physics.
Yeah. Until it comes to free will, and then they ignore physics.
Okay, let me actually just tackle from the roundtable Vaden and I had on my podcast that's also part of your podcast. The principle of optimism's got the exact same problem, right? Is that you can say, all problems are solvable, and then Sam Harris says, what if you're on an island and everything's the consistency of cheese? And the thing I pointed out is that at that point, for all intents and purposes, we might as well just say the laws of physics have declared you dead and that this is an insoluble problem. The problem is that any problem that is insoluble in some sense violates the laws of physics, and every problem that is soluble in some sense doesn't violate the laws of physics. And it's really hard to even pose the problems if you don't know them well enough to know if the laws of physics say they're possible or not. Okay. So is communism, is that impossible because of the coordination problem? Do the laws of physics keep communism from working? Well, what if we have some future science fiction society and all of them are a hive mind and they can share each other's, you can easily come up with ways around the coordination problem as long as you're allowed to jump to any amount of science fiction future knowledge that you want. Okay. So you can't really say communism denies the laws of physics. Of course, what you really mean is at our current level of knowledge, this is against the laws of physics, but that's just as true for public goods. So there's a kind of, they want to use it to say one way, it's kind of a one-way arrow here, right? If it's an argument that we're against, laws of physics argument, you can't prove to me it's against the laws of physics. If it's one that we're, in favor or we're against it, like communism, oh no, right now that's impossible, so that's against the laws of physics. It's a completely pointless argument. It's literally the easiest to various argument that you can imagine.
It seems like it's a misapplication of Deutsch's insight. So like when he talks about the laws of physics thing, I just view that as a stopping criterion and as a way to determine if it's worthwhile, say, investigating how to live forever. That's how I use that kind of principle and that insight. Similarly, like you could talk about the principle of the conservation of energy. Well, okay, that's a principle that has useful applications, but to talk about the conservation of energy in the realm of politics, while true, it's just not a valuable place to apply that insight. It's not in the domain where that insight really is applicable. And that's kind of what I see what's happening with this laws of physics thing. It's like, it's not that it's false. It's just that it's a total non sequitur compared to what we're actually interested in talking about. It's just a distraction. It's just a smokescreen.
And that's why at the moment, the correct answer is incrementalism. If you have a theory as a libertarian, I could get rid of this public good and I can start a business, then go put your money where your mouth is and go put your money at risk, not mine, and start the business. Okay. And that's how we do it in an open society. We will get rid of public goods just as fast as someone is willing to go put their money on the line because they have a good idea to get rid of that public good. Okay. And if someday we probably will get rid of the post office once the government actually figures out that it's just cheaper to let it be privatized and they can subsidize it or something like that. And there's a lot of things that we think of today as public goods that we will probably eventually retire. Maybe all of them. I don't know. Okay. But it's really up to the libertarians to get their money together, go take the risk with their money. Somebody's got to put their money on the line, right? That's how private goods work. And if they don't have a good idea, and this is how you know they don't have the knowledge themselves, right? Because if they knew how to start a police force that was more profit, had better profit margin, and they could just sell the services to governments, they'd be doing it, right? The fact that they aren't doing it, I know for a fact that they don't have the knowledge either. And that's just how this works, okay? Okay, let me now pull all this back to the original question of George ought to help, okay? So, and all of this, I know it seems like a digression, but we've now actually answered the question in a very compelling way. Okay. So what's going on with George ought to help is, and I'm going to do this using libertarian terms, which I don't normally do. Okay. But according to libertarians, there's only one right. It's property rights. Okay. Property rights are loose enough how you define them. A right to life can be thought of as a property right. Everything can be thought of as a property right. Okay. So what George ought to help is doing is it's creating a state where the people there have no property right to take George's money. Okay. And as Vaden pointed out, you can easily switch that. So let's switch it. Okay. Under what circumstance? Now, think of this as you want to refute your own theories. If you want to come up with a great story like this, a great narrative, but you aren't going to go stretch it to its breaking point, you're not a critical rationalist. Okay, let's try to find a scenario where we would give the inverse answer to George ought to help. So let's say that George lives in a little neighborhood that has a homeowners association. And this homeowners association, he contracted with when he moved in. This is to Ben's point, right? And they said that they've got certain voting rights, and you show up to meetings and you get to have a vote, and then they're going to collect dues. You've agreed to collect those dues, and they get to and this homeowners association has it's like a little mini government, which is what homeowners associations are. They are mini governments. Even David Friedman admits this. Okay, they might have a way to resolve differences, some sort of way to make up rules, a lawmaking body. They might have some way to enforce things. Okay, so they actually have all the branches of government in a homeowners association. If, according to those rules that George has bought off on via contract, they have a right to raise the dues by vote and then have a little fund that they can then help people out with so that they don't lose their homes. They've come with their explanation that they've sold the members of the homeowners association on. Okay. And George says, I don't agree with that, so I'm not going to pay that part of the dues. What happens to George? Okay. Even in a libertarian world, we say, no, you're contracted to. You are now initiating force against us. You are coercing us. And all libertarians would agree. And we're going to now go take the police. We're going to throw George in jail. And he absolutely must pay this. Okay. Now, libertarians will agree with me on this. And when I brought this up, they will immediately say, oh, but that's like a really small thing, right? It's just one little neighbor. I'm okay with it with one little neighborhood. Okay. But I don't mean for a whole country. It's like, okay, well, what if that homeowners association using their rules decides to merge with the one next to them?
Exactly.
Then the one next to them, then the one next to them. As long as they're following the rules, then you are part of that contract and they have a right to do that. If they happen to take up a whole country and it's one giant homeowners association, okay, they absolutely, you consented to it every step of the way. Okay. And that is just how it works. You don't get to say, once I see how my rules turned out, oh, I didn't mean that. Okay. You're not allowed to. And what they're doing is they say, oh, well, yeah, but you're not allowed to do it that large. It's like, okay, as a conservative, why are you telling me I can't make certain kinds of contracts? Okay. I thought you guys were the free contract people. No, it's me. Okay, because I can make this contract, and I think I should.
Well, and now it's in the position where the libertarians are saying what contracts are allowed and not allowed, and that sounds a lot like a government to me.
That's right.
Who's the state?
And how are you going to stop me if I decide that I want my homeowners association to be the size of a state or the size of a country, and I vote for that? Okay, and you tell me you're not allowed to do that. How are you going to stop me without a government? Right?
Exactly.
Okay, so. By doing this, now I actually took one of my libertarian friends through this, and he agreed to every step, not realizing what he was agreeing to. Then suddenly he realized, oh my gosh, governments are legal under libertarian rules, right? They're part of the free market. And he goes, no, that would never happen. Universal explainers would never allow this to happen. I'm like, no, dude, this is not only do universal explainers allow this to happen, they have done it multiple times. You are living in the libertarian utopia today. We're in an anarcho-capitalist society. You just don't recognize it for what it is.
Yeah.
And this is actually the correct answer to George ought to help, right? Is that, in fact, I can even prove it to you that we live in an anarcho-capitalist society today, okay? Imagine I can do this for America. I don't know about you Canadians. Maybe you Canadians really are a bunch of really awful robber barons, okay? We all know that a lot of governments did start off as robber barons. That's why libertarians often say that governments are robber barons. I mean, if you go back far enough in time, the first governments were a bunch of people who just asserted authority over everybody else and enslaved them, and they were pretty bad. Okay. That's not true for America. And that's why I like using America as the example. Imagine in America that you are on this boat coming over. And this is, maybe there's 3 colonies right now. We haven't gotten to the full 13. And you are stepping off the boat. Now, first of all, you know what you're signing up for when you get on that boat. Like, there is no doubt that you absolutely know what you're signing up for. So let's pretend like there's like this sign that you see as you step off the boat and you've come over to America from England, let's say, because they were oppressive, compared to us Americans. And the sign says, "We are a desperate band of robber barons. We claim this territory as our own. If you choose to live here, you are consenting to be robbed regularly. We refer to this robbing as taxes. But good news, we are very special robber barons. We only rob you if you live in our territory, and you're welcome to leave anytime you want, and we'll leave you unmolested. And we'll actually offer a number of services in exchange for this robbing. For one, we offer you actual protection. I don't mean mafia protection. I mean actual police forces and judicial services and people that solve problems. And we elect the robbers by democratic representation, and you are free to run for office yourself." So here's your choices. You really have three choices. You can live inside our robber barony, and you can accept that we're going to rob you once a year, or you're welcome to go start your own robber barony. You can go walk off somewhere, and you can take your chance of starting a separate colony and set up your own. Or you've even got a third choice. If you really, really value your freedom, we're going to give you the choice to be free. You can walk off into the wilderness, and you can just live entirely on your own. Maybe other people will come live next to you, and then you guys can just sort of work it out yourself, whatever happens, right? But you'll be free. Okay.
There's a fourth choice, Bruce, which is you can live there and then you can complain about it online for the rest of your life.
And every time taxation season comes around, my God, the rest of Twitter they'll hear about it.
Yeah.
They will hear about it.
So what do people do in real life? They choose to be robbed. They consent to be robbed, which is why we don't call taxes theft, because it is a contract. Okay. Now, you might argue here, and I've had libertarians argue this to me, no, you need to be able to stop a contract. If you've entered into a contract, you have to be able to turn it back off, and you can't do that with taxes. Therefore, Bruce, I've got you. I'd say, okay, let's go back to the Homeowners Association. Okay, you live in a Homeowners Association, you've agreed to the dues. Then you die, and your son now owns the house. Does he get to say, oh no, I didn't contract for these dues, so I don't have to pay them? So let's say he even makes that argument. Okay, what happens? Well, we take him, we show that actually he does have to pay the dues legally, and we throw him in jail. Okay, even though it's all by contract. How can we explain this? Because even a libertarian, when I asked my libertarian friend, how would you resolve this? Before he realized where I was going with it, he goes, oh yeah, you'd throw the guy in jail. He owes those dues. Okay. Once he knew I was talking about government, he says, oh no, I back off that, right? Here's why. It's because that Homeowners Association has a property right to be the ones who provide the services within that territory. Okay. What George Ought to Help is missing is the question of, does the government have a property right? Okay, now, governments don't put it in terms of property rights. That's not the way we'd normally speak of it. That's a libertarian way of looking at it. Okay, but it is the key question. If the government has a property right to be the ones who provide that service within that territory, and if the original person who entered it consented, which they did, in America at least, okay, then they own that right from that point forward. They already own it. They have that right. You don't get to just say it's illegal and I take it back. They own it. You have to buy it back. Okay. That's incrementalism, by the way, that we can get rid of government taxes and government services by incrementally removing them, because then you're following the correct libertarian contract laws. Okay. By insisting that it's theft, you're simply ignoring the fact that they own that right. Now, you might at this point say, well, libertarians don't agree that governments own that right. Okay. Let me put this into an analogy then. Okay. Let's say that we all live in some neighborhood and most of us rent from the guy who's up on the hill. Okay. And suddenly this guy comes running in. He's, his hair is, in a mess, and he's shouting, the people on the hill don't own their house, and so we don't owe them rent. So you stop and you look at him and you go, okay, that's a serious charge. So I'm assuming you've got some sort of evidence that they don't have that right. And they go, like, do you have like a deed? And they're like, no, I don't have any deed. Well, how do you know that they don't own that right to charge us rent then? And it's like, oh, well, I just know it. I mean, I can just tell that they don't have that right. Okay, this is a question of rights, though. They either have the right or they don't. You've got no evidence. Let's say we want to resolve this with libertarians. Where would you go? Well, you would go to the courts. The courts would determine if the government has the right to charge taxes for their services or not, and whether you've consented to it or not. Okay, or your progenitors consented to it, if they have that right at this point. Okay, well, I know what the courts are going to say, and every libertarian knows what the court's going to say. They're going to say, yep, they have that right. Okay, and at least through the mechanisms that we have, this has been determined. We know the government has every right, owns a property right to provide certain services in exchange for taxes, and there's certain constitutional laws by which we're allowed to change that and change the taxes and change the services and things like that. Okay, just like a homeowners association. In fact, modern governments are just very large homeowners associations. That's exactly what they are. Okay. Now, the argument the libertarians make where they say, oh, no, you're forcing me to move out. Well, guess what? That's how homeowners associations do. You get to stop the contract. Remember, they own the right. Okay. They can't have that right follow you if you leave. But within that territory where that property right exists, you will keep paying those dues until you decide to leave. Now, I do get the libertarian point that once it's the size of a government, a country, that leaving is a hardship. Okay, and we talk about voting with your feet. And it's not the easiest thing to get citizenship in some other country, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, so I understand why they've got this concern with consent in this case, but there's no real lack of consent. Okay, the real issue is that it's really hard to change. And unfortunately, that kind of happened by market forces. I don't know if you guys know American history, but Shays' Rebellion, they tried really hard in America to stick with something really close to the libertarian ideal, where you had all these little tiny polities, and you could choose by which ones you wanted to live in. And basically, Shays' Rebellion happened, where a farmer started a giant rebellion and just about took over, right? Just with a bunch of not some general. And they had absolutely no way to stop him, and there was no way to coordinate against him. So that led to all the different individual states, which would be like these homeowner associations, voting through their property rights to merge into one federal government, which is the Constitution of the United States. Okay, nothing against that in terms of libertarianism. This is following libertarianism to the T. Okay. So basically it was market forces that led to governments being as large as countries. I don't know what to tell libertarians. Okay, you can incrementally change that by putting your own money on the line, but they do have the right at this point. And your whole argument, taxes or theft, is based on the assumption they don't have that property right when in fact they do, as far as I can tell.
So maybe a good way to summarize your arguments there is that libertarianism is not different. It's not a different system to what we have today in terms of a kind. Like, it's not a completely different kind of system. It's different in terms of degree. And it seems like most of the libertarian solutions simply propose similar systems to what we have, but at a smaller and perhaps arguably more voluntary scale. Now, we can argue about that scale and precisely what things like homeowner associations and proprietary communities and whatnot, and what they actually offer in the terms of those conditions, etc. But in terms of it being a moral issue, if you point out that libertarianism and their preferred solutions are just a scaled down version of what we have at the moment, a lot of the moral arguments now disappear, because the moral arguments are typically saying some act is prohibited or it's not prohibited. Something is morally wrong or it's not morally wrong. So something like taxation is theft, right? But if their preferred solutions still have the notion of taxation, et cetera, a lot of what they're worried about on the normative front simply disappears, because they're not actually replacing it. They're just changing how it looks and typically just scaling it down. And so a lot of the force of the moral arguments seem to just vanish, right? Because they're not actually getting rid of them. They're just proposing it, a slightly different flavor of it.
It actually inverts the moral arguments, I would argue. Okay, so if I make a rule that you are not allowed to make certain kinds of contracts, and in fact, those contracts are the most efficient way under our current source level of knowledge, then you're actually stopping the means of error correction. Okay, governments need to have the right through their lawmaking bodies to do things that maybe you're not going to like, because, like, let's use the mask law argument. Strangely, there are libertarians who think mask laws are okay using libertarian arguments, and there's those who think that they're abominations using libertarian arguments. Part of the problem with libertarian arguments is that they're so easy to vary that you can just pick which parts you want. So, but let's take the argument mask laws are wrong because they're forcing you to do something, and I have a right to not wear something on my face. Okay. And you can even make the argument that they're bad. Like, you could make the moral argument or the utilitarian argument, and you could say, if you don't make mask laws, then individual businesses will come up with much better solutions for how we're going to avoid spreading COVID or whatever. Okay. Let's even say that's true. Okay, let's, for the sake of argument, assume that's true. What they're really proposing is that we make a sort of constitutional statement that says you're not allowed to make certain kinds of laws. And to some degree, we do that with rights, right? But like, this is way more specific. And we're going to, even if it turns out to be right, that we shouldn't ever make that kind of law, we want our system to have the flexibility to try it, see what happens, and then try something better. That's what error correction is. So it actually inverts the moral argument. The moral argument is in favor of governments and then incrementally changing them and not knowing which direction we want to go with it and finding it out through actually testing out different policies instead of trying to say, well, I'm saying morally this is wrong, therefore you can't even try this legally. That actually shuts down the means of error correction.
I'm curious about the following thought that I had. So we're talking about libertarianism as if they're the only political faction that uses moral arguments, but that's obviously not true. The other side that I can see that uses a lot of moral arguments are the woke, right? And in particular, that oppression is always wrong, that diversity is always good, equity is always good, et cetera, et cetera. A third example I can think of is, say, evangelical Tea Party conservatives talking about the sanctity of the body, of the family, and these kind of sanctity arguments. So I want to make a claim, something like the weaker the concrete case you can make, the more you have to fall back on moral arguments. Because if you could just come up with a very clear, amoral, this is the thing that's practically going to work best, then everyone would use that first, because that's going to be the widest possible agreement and the most persuasive. But I think you only fall back on moral case when you can't do the more practical, neutral, widely apolitical case. And so the fact that the libertarians have their flavor of moral arguments that are different from the woke, which are different from the evangelicals, but yet all three of these camps seem to quickly retreat to the moral case as soon as they're backed into a corner. That strikes me as a huge weakness amongst all three of these political leanings. And I'm curious if you would agree or disagree with that characterization, that the moral argument tends to be the last resort, the final retreat, what you do when you're backed into a corner.
So I think that you're right, but I do think you're missing something important here, which is that people care more about moral arguments than they care about utilitarian arguments.
Good.
I do think part of what open societies do is they force you to make utilitarian arguments, right? If I know, because God told me, so that such and such is moral or immoral, okay, I'm welcome in the open society to go say, God said so, but nobody's going to pay attention to me. So instead, I'm going to have to remake my argument as a utilitarian argument.
Can I interrupt you just for a sec? Because I know some listeners are going to balk at that. And they're going to say, well, utilitarianism is a moral case. But you mean that more in just like the practical sense, right? Like just what works well. And so when you use the term utilitarian, you're not thinking about it in terms of necessarily the utilitarianism and John Stuart Mill and all that. You're thinking about it much more just what's going to get the job done.
Although there is a tie there because, of course, this is what John Stuart Mill believes he was doing. So in other words, I can argue, don't spank your kid because that's immoral. And maybe I should make that argument. Or I can argue, if you spank your kids, there's these negative impacts. And really, even in terms of what you value, in terms of what you're hoping will happen with your kids or the relationship you want with your kids, this is going to be negative, even in terms of your own subjective values. Okay. The second's the utilitarian argument, where I don't have to appeal to the moral. But it's true that we're forced to convert our moral arguments into utilitarian arguments in an open society. And that's a good thing that we have to do that. But I really think people will kind of sign up for these different ideologies for the moral arguments.
Yeah, the moral arguments are the things that animate people and get their interest in the first place.
Right. Right.
That's great. But then because you and I and Ben and 1,000 other people have different morals, pragmatically, the best way to convince people with different moral intuitions, different moral frameworks, is to convert that into the pragmatic, into the practical, into the what's That's actually going to work. And
let's call it pragmatic instead of utilitarian to avoid the John Stuart Mills. Okay.
I think you're ignoring that figuring out what works in the pragmatic case is a normative judgment. So we want to say like progress is measured relative to some normative framework. And so I think like to say that you should retreat from the moral and simply consider the consequences. Well, people have different perspectives on how good or bad the consequences are, right? So the Tea Partiers aren't going to think that rolling out more rights, like abortion rights, it constitutes a step forward. And that it, comes from a normative claim about the status of abortion. Similarly with the woke and the progress of Western civilization, et cetera, they're going to take issue with some of those kinds of claims. And so to even talk about like pragmatics, I think stuffs under the rug a lot of normative claims already. So I don't think you can neatly separate it into like, if I don't have a good normative argument, I just have to make a pragmatic case, like pragmatic with respect to what sort of consequences.
Yeah, well, I don't think that conversation, yes, it's in the background. Yes, one can have it, but I just don't think that is relevant for most specific local conversations. So for example, if you are building IKEA furniture and the question is, should I use a Phillips head screwdriver or a star-shaped screwdriver? You don't need to necessarily say, well, are you using a consequentialist framework and how much do you value the progress and the accomplishment of your goals? It's just like, well, this is going to work better than this other thing. And I think if you're building roads, if you're talking about vaccinations, you don't need to convince people of the value of consequentialism to convince people that their kids are going to die less if they're vaccinated for smallpox, say. And so that's all I mean when I say talking in terms of pragmatics, things that are so obviously true that thinking in terms of consequences and the value of progress doesn't even rise to the surface because everyone just agrees this is definitely the right thing to do to move forward.
So let me say this. I think that Vaden is right in that if you don't have your moral theory worked out to where it has actual testable consequences, then what you're going to try to go after is, well, you're an immoral person if you don't do this. Okay. But true moral theories always have actual testable consequences. Otherwise, they're actually just false morals. So if I could use the example that Ben used, abortion is wrong from evangelical Tea Party perspective or whatever. When I'm talking with people from that group, I'm very conservative myself. I'm even morally very conservative. Okay, I actually do have concerns about allowing too many abortions. I actually start with, is your goal to just outlaw abortion or is your goal to reduce abortions? Because those may not be the same thing, right?
Yeah, nice.
In other words, I actually start with the fact that the pragmatics and the moral are so intertwined.
Yeah, nice.
That they can't really be separated. And instead of concentrating your whole thing on, abortion is wrong, to oh, because abortion is wrong, what is the right thing for me to do to try to reduce abortions? It sort of shifts the argument. If I don't have a good argument in that way, then I think I do exactly what Vaden is saying. I just say, well, abortion is wrong anyhow, and I've got nothing else to go off of. If I had a good pragmatic argument, of course I was leading with it, right? I do think I start to get concerned as a conservative who was trying to look at the pragmatic cases when I was talking to the libertarians. The red flags were the very strong moral arguments that didn't make sense to me, right? Taxes are theft. No, they're not. No, taxes are theft. No, they're not. Right?
Yeah.
But they take your money and they don't tell you not to. No, I have agreed to give them my money in exchange for a service. I've contracted with them. No, you didn't. You can't turn it off. No, I can. I can move.
Yes.
This is...
Well, and it's funny when they tell you what you should think about taxes. Like when people say taxes are theft, my response now is, well, I don't feel like it's theft. I feel like I'm paying my dues here. And so maybe in your mind, you feel like you're being stolen from, but that's not everybody. And I certainly don't feel that way. And I willingly pay my taxes.
And even if you do feel like you're being stolen from, objectively, you're not. And that's legally speaking, that's the answer, right? You're welcome to feel anything you want as long as you keep paying your taxes because you do, in fact, owe them, right? Because that is a property right that the government happens to own.
I think that is a great place to stick the landing on this first conversation. Any final thoughts on y'all's side before we conclude this first burst?
No, nothing here. I'm excited for economic issues and to actually dive into some of the interesting cases and some of the places where I think libertarian thought has contributed a lot, and libertarian critiques are very valuable. So I'm excited. There's a lot of bashing libertarians on this one, so hopefully we'll give them their due on the next one.
Well, yeah, I'm excited about the economics too, because as I was, mentioning in the email chain, that a great deal of the fact could easily be repurposed to attack my own viewpoint.
Yeah, good.
And it did so fairly effectively. Let me just say that I only broke down and cried and had an existential crisis 3 or 4 times. If it had been, 12, couple dozen, that might have been a problem. But 3 or 4 times breaking down and crying is not that bad, so I can deal with that.
Well, that's a great teaser, because we didn't talk about it too much this episode, but for listeners, we'll put it into the show notes. And if you want to do some homework for the next episode and read the first section, then I think that will be great background material and see what it is that made Bruce Nielson cry 3 or 4 times. I'm actually excited to see which of the arguments are most interesting.
There were some arguments in there that I had never heard that I thought were concerning to my own viewpoint. Right? Not that I have changed my mind. I haven't. Yeah. And I will explain to you why I haven't.
Oh, this will be fun. Okay, good. I'm really looking forward to this. That's amazing. Okay, cool. Well, this was great. I look forward to continuing the conversation. And to our libertarian listeners, I hope you still love us and write in, and we will do something with that writing. I don't know if we're going to read it out loud or not, but but write in. Yeah.
I think if it makes an interesting case in a cogent way, we should sort of commit to reading it out, even if it doesn't persuade us. I think earlier you had said if it persuades us, then we'll read it out. But I think the bar should be lower than that.
Yeah, that's an excellent
point. Like a well-written response.
Yeah,
and we'll deal with it.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, great. Thank you.
Nice.
Thank you, guys.